Ever make a mistake you knew was a mistake, but you did it anyway? That's this table. A 3.2 meter slab of walnut. 2 months of work and my first real client. And not once did I stop to think, wait, is this a good idea? I was too deep in the excitement, too proud, too focused on making it just perfect. 5 days after delivery, I went back just to check in, to see how it looked in place. It wasn't home, so I walked onto the patio and my jaw dropped. One glance and I knew. And the worst part, I couldn't even be surprised. But let's rewind. Before I cut a single board, I took a moment just to feel the wood. These 3 slabs would become the biggest table I ever built, and they were far from perfect. They had cracks, twists, and knots everywhere, but somehow that made me like them even more. Each of these imperfections tells a story. The question is, do they add character or cause problems down the line? What do you guys think? Would you leave them in or cut them out? The slabs were way too big for my workbench, so I had to get creative. I grabbed some chalk, a concrete floor, and some rough mat. I marked out the final size right on the shop floor, 3.2 meters of walnut glory. This was my canvas. Using that outline, I traced where each slab would be cut. Once I made these cuts, there was no going back. I started by lining up the track saw rails along my chalk marks. One clean pass and the first slab was in 2 pieces. Since the slabs were all shorter than the final 3.2 meters, I cut matching walnut pieces to add on to each end. Grain direction like this isn't really ideal, but it was the only way to get the full length. Once the layout was in place, the ends looked unnaturally straight, almost too perfect. So I marked a softer, more natural curve, something that would blend into the grain when carved. With the extensions cut, I clamped one to the bench and started taking off the bark with the chisel. Some areas came off clean, others were fibrous and needed a bit more work. Once it was stripped, I used carving bits on the grinder and drill to shape the ends following the chalk lines I marked earlier. This gave them a more natural, organic look instead of a straight cut. By the end, the bench was covered in chips and dust, but the shape was exactly what I wanted. With the slabs shaped, it was time to build the foundation for everything, the mold. A single melamine sheet is only 2.8 meters long, which meant I had to join 2 together just to fit this 3.2 meter mastodon. First, I marked everything out directly on a sheet: the base, the wall, the reinforcements, and the extension pieces. The base was too big for my table saw, so I cut it on the floor with my track saw. Then I moved on to the walls and the smaller parts back to the table saw. One cut at a time, trying not to lose track of which piece was which. Once everything was ready, I screwed the reinforcements to the bottom panel, and then I had to flip it over. That went about as well as you'd expect. But eventually, I got it upright without breaking anything. I caulked the joint for the extension, screwed it in, and taped over the seam. Then, I added the walls, checking every corner for squareness before sealing all the edges with caulk. Finally, I sprayed the mold release, and with that, the form was ready for the pour. Before committing to 70 kilos of epoxy, I did one last test fit. All the slabs went into the mold, edge to edge, just to make sure my chalk lines, cuts, and extensions actually lined up. I clamped everything down so it wouldn't float once the epoxy started flowing, and leveled the mold for one final time. This was it, 70 kilos of epoxy for a single table. I cracked open the first jugs, and the shop instantly filled with that sharp chemical smell. Into the bucket it went, thick, slow, like pouring honey in winter. I added the black pigment, just enough to be mysterious, but not so much it looked painted. A quick stir and it transformed. Deep, inky, and final. Once this hits the mold, there's no undo button. The first stream slid into the mold like oil over glass, creeping into every knot and gap. From above, it looked perfect. From below, I was already wondering if I'd made the walls strong enough. Epoxy is heavy, it's very heavy. And when it leaks, it doesn't just leak, it escapes. The second bucket came out darker. I wanted more contrast, more drama in the grain. The change was risky, but epoxy doesn't wait for second thoughts. Flame over the surface, bubbles popping in quick bursts. Half full now, heavy enough to make me question, would it hold, or would I walk tomorrow to a $700 puddle on the floor? The last buckets went in, thick, glossy, and slow to settle. I scraped every drop into the corners, and I made sure no spot was dry. And then it was perfect, completely still. That's when reality hit me. There was nothing left to do but wait. And wait. And wait. At some point, I started wondering if I should have just built a regular table. But nope, I just kept waiting and losing my mind in the process. After what it felt like forever, it was finally time. A quick tap, it was solid. Let's see if it behaves. The screws came out easy enough. But the real fight, that's with the mold. First edge, crack. Another great start. I've had builds turn into hours of cursing at melamine. But then, that sweet sound of epoxy letting go. A little persuasion with chisels and wedges, and we're free. If it had stuck, planing melamine off for hours would have been a nightmare. Demolding went well, from what it seems. I was afraid of this. If it got stuck, it would have been a pain to plane all of this into the melamine on the back. So I'm pretty happy with this. Of course, the bottom decided to cling on for dear life. There's always something. So far, so good. But little did I know that this was just the easy part. With the mold gone, it was time to flatten this monster. My CNC doesn't care if it's walnut or plywood, it just chews through it. Pass after pass, the rough surface gave way to a perfect plane. Then came the nerve-wracking part, trimming to final size. Every cut now mattered. Dragging 100+ kilos of walnut and epoxy is basically CrossFit, except the table doesn't really cheer you on. I laid down the tracks, squared my marks, and I didn't rush here. Once it's cut, there's no going back. The first slice, clean. A quick feel along the edge told me it was all good. One more cut and it was locked in at final dimensions. Tracks back on the wall and on to the next step. But looking back, maybe it was already too perfect for its own good. With the edges now squared, it was time to soften them. Out came the router, one of the tools that's both fun and terrifying in the wrong hands. A smooth round over changes everything. It takes slab and turns it into table. Walnut sawdust. It gets everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Next, the hidden support. This table will sit on a massive steel plate, but I didn't want it visible from the side. So I marked 4 centimeters in and started carving a recess all the way around. I could have used the CNC, but here's the thing. The table's been sitting for days and the wood always moves. If I referenced the CNC bed, I'd be carving into its flatness and not the tables. That movement, it would show on the wood. So I stuck with the router, an 8mm bit, which on a 3.2 meter table is about as fast as carving it with a spoon. Hours later, I was ankle deep in walnut chips. So just to explain why I'm doing this table is gonna sit on a plate and I wanna countersunk it so it doesn't show. The thing is that why I'm doing this with the router instead of the CNC is because the table cupped just a little bit, and rather than having an uneven surface, I'd rather take my reference from what we already have, and even though it takes longer, it's much better and safer for me to make sure that everything's right. The vacuum got a workout that day, and there it was. A clean, even recess, just 3 millimeters deep. Next up, sanding and figuring out how to sneak the LED lighting into the build. But first, I had to go even deeper. It now has an inset of 3 millimeters for the plate it's gonna sit in. What I need to do next is to sand everything up to at least 180 grit, and then because it's gonna have LED lights, we are going to need to go a little bit deeper so we can install those. Finally, it's done. Oh, and here's where reality decided to remind me I'm human. The router slipped, taking just a little too much off the edge. The fix: cutting a matching walnut patch and carve it out the pocket for it to sit flush. A little sanding to convince it to behave. Then some glue. A clamp, and we'll just pretend that this never happened. The router's job is now done. Time for my Festool sander loaded with fresh 40 grit. This table is not gonna move itself. Sanding is one of those jobs you don't see the hours, but you feel them in your shoulders. That little patch from earlier, now it needs to blend in like it was always there. A few careful passes and you'd have to know where to look just to spot it. More sanding, edges, corners, anywhere the machine can't quite reach. This is where hands do what tools can't. Every pass makes the walnut grain pop just a little more. Then, a surprise. A small void revealed itself after cutting the inset. When I came back the next day, the table had cupped. Not much, but enough to notice. Some people would panic here. I've learned just to breathe and get creative. I grabbed a couple of damp blankets, spread them over the tabletop, and let them do their thing. So, why did I cover this? It cupped a little bit. Because of the cupping, I still have to finish the other side a little bit, and I don't want it to be cupped when I do all the work. So I put a little bit of moisture here. The thing is that this part was already sanded and sealed a little bit, and it caused it to cup a little bit upwards, but it's not something noticeable. But I still want it to be perfect, and because I want it to be perfect, I just dampened a little bit these blankets, and I'll leave them here for about 30 minutes, and I think we should be fine. As you can see, there's a little bit of space here because of the cupping. It should be like it is here, because I know my workbench is flat. So I'm leaving it here, and hopefully it will go back to its original shape. With that disaster handled, it was time to sand again. First, I scraped across the entire surface with a pencil. You sand until all the marks disappear, and you know you've hit every spot evenly. 40 grit to start. It's loud, it's dusty, but there's no skipping this step if you want a smooth walnut. Back and forth, watching those pencil marks vanish. Slowly, the epoxy and the wood started to level into one plane. There's something very satisfying about that moment, where it stops feeling like a raw slab and it starts feeling like a table. A quick wipe down with a wet rag, and there it was. That deep black river cutting through the rich browns of the walnut. Still rough, but you can already see where it's going. I couldn't wait to get it to the CNC for the final phases. The front edge got a pass on the CNC too. Then I grabbed the router for the roundovers. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to make it feel soft under your hand. It's one of those details most people don't really notice, until it's not there and they cut themselves. Another wipe down, and it was time for the polishing compound. Working with the polisher, bringing out the subtle sheen before the oil. At this stage, you really get to know the table. Every curve, every knot, every tiny imperfection. Then, the moment every woodworker lives for, hardwood oil. One pass with the brush and the walnut came alive. The black epoxy turned almost mirror-like. This was the payoff for all the noise, the dust and the sanding. You get to see the wood the way it was always meant to be. I could have stopped there, but the client wanted something special. LED lighting hidden underneath, washing that big metal base in a glow. I pulled out the router again, cut a clean channel into the underside, ran a strip through and locked it in place with a few drops of CA glue. It's a small detail, but when the lights come on, it changes everything. And through all of this, in the back of my mind, I still had a little voice asking, was it all this going to hold up? Or had I just built a 2-month-old mistake? With the last pass of the sander, it was time for the final touch. My mark. The polished timber brand burned right into the walnut, a signature of 2 months of work. I packed it up, delivered it to my client, and we set it up in place in the garden. It looked perfect. The black river catching the sunlight, the walnut glowing, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe this is the best table I ever made. Except I already knew I made a mistake. 5 days later, I came back to check on it. The client wasn't home, so I walked around the patio and my jaw just dropped. The epoxy had split clean through. The wood had opened up like it was trying to escape the table. Hot sun during the day, cold nights, the expansion and contraction tore it apart. And the worst part, I wasn't even surprised. I knew from the start, epoxy tables don't belong outside. But I've let my excitement override my common sense. I didn't build this table for the outdoors. I built it for my ego. So I'm taking a break from epoxy. No more resins, no more rivers for a while. The next projects are gonna be pure wood. I'm building the client another table, this time designed to survive the elements without any epoxy. And I'm also gonna fix this one and I'm gonna give it to the client for free. Sometimes the biggest lessons in woodworking are the ones you already knew about, but had to relearn the hard way. Next week, we start something different, the cover desk. No epoxy, no gimmicks, just fine furniture. You want to subscribe and not miss this one. It's the boldest project I've done so far. So see you then.